Alright, hi students, this is Dr. Spellman recording my first video lecture for professional ethics. We'll see how it goes. Alright, today we're going to talk about confidentiality. It's a topic that we talked a little bit about last week. I'm going to pick back up today. For a reminder, we'll talk a little bit about devil's advocacy, the topic that Humer covered. According to Humer, right, he's interested in particular about what he calls devil's advocacy, and that is when a lawyer defends guilty clients, or more specifically, when a lawyer sort of tries to help a client receive what he calls an unjust legal outcome. The first premise of that argument is that defending guilty clients causes, or at least allows, injustice. Maybe not every time you defend a guilty client do you cause or allow an injustice, right? You might be a lawyer for someone who's accused of a crime and help them avoid some really harsh punishment. If that punishment would have been unjust, then it's okay to defend that client and try and help them avoid that unjust punishment. But what Humer's arguing is just that you can't defend a client if you sort of know that they've committed the crime and you know that the punishment that they're facing is a just one. Okay, so with those sort of caveats in mind, premise one looks pretty plausible, that when we defend guilty clients, we cause or at least allow injustices. Premise two is the claim that causing or allowing injustices is morally wrong. That claim also seems pretty plausible. He uses the example of Sally and Joe to support that idea. And then the conclusion is that defending guilty clients is morally wrong. Now, if you look at the form, right, it's a valid form, it's got a good structure, there's this act, it has this empirical property, it causes or allows something unjust to occur. Premise two says causing or allowing injustice is morally wrong, and so we conclude that defending guilty clients is morally wrong. It's a valid inference, so if there's something wrong with it, it's got to be a problem with the premises. Now, Humer also gives another argument, an analogical argument, against devil's advocacy, and that goes like this. So premise one is that Sally's behavior is wrong. You'll remember that Sally is the friend of Joe, the serial murderer, who was killing a bunch of people. I think he's killed 6 people, right? And he tells Sally this deep, dark secret and asks her to keep it confidential. And Sally, being Joe's friend, she agrees and she keeps it secret, and she even sort of maybe helps him hide a body or something like that. Now, Humer thinks that's clearly wrong. I think all of us think, yeah, that's wrong, even though Sally's Joe's friend. If Joe's a murderer, we should tell someone about that. Premise 2 says defending guilty clients is morally equivalent to Sally's behavior. That seems pretty plausible, right? We talked about some objections, but Humer's got pretty good responses to those objections. Whether or not premise 2 is true is something for you to sort of think through and decide on your own, but it at least has a lot of similar features, at least the feature that it causes or allows an injustice is a feature that those things have in common, and that suggests that maybe both acts are wrong. So the conclusion is that if Sally's behavior is wrong and defending guilty clients is equivalent to that, then defending guilty clients is wrong as well. Now, Humer's arguments apply not just to devil's advocacy, right? Because the thing that he has in mind, the thing that he thinks is wrong, is just causing or allowing an injustice. And so this idea that we can't defend guilty clients, we shouldn't protect confidentiality. If we know our client's guilty, we shouldn't hide that and continue advocating for that client, but maybe we could even reveal that information, right? That idea is going to transfer to all sorts of cases about for physicians, nurses, teachers, engineers, anyone. Right? And that brings us to the case of the infected spouse. So Kenneth Kipnis is going to disagree with Humer, whereas Humer thinks breaching confidentiality is okay in some cases. Kipnis thinks it's wrong to breach confidentiality, and the case of the infected spouse is the one that he uses to argue for this. So here's the case. It's 1982, right? After moving to Honolulu, Wilma and Andrew Long visit your office, and they ask you to be their family physician. They've been your patients ever since. 6 years later, right, in 1988, the two decide to separate. Wilma leaves for the mainland, occasionally sending you a postcard. Though you do not see her professionally, you still think of yourself as her doctor. This is in 1990, 8 years after they first came to you, 2 years after they separated. Andrew comes into your office and says that he's embarked upon a more sophisticated social life. Right, that's one way to put it. Right? So the thought is that Andrew's sleeping around with other partners, and he's been hearing about some new sexually transmitted diseases. He wants to be tested. So testing reveals that Andrew is positive for the AIDS virus, and he receives the appropriate counseling. And 1 year later, right, visiting your office for a checkup, Andrew tells you that Wilma is planning to return to Hawaii for a reconciliation with him. She arrives that afternoon and will be staying in the Moana Hotel. Despite your best efforts to persuade him, Andrew leaves without giving you assurance that he will tell Wilma about his infection or protect her against becoming infected. So you're like, whoa, Andrew, you're going to be reconciling with Wilma. I know that you're positive for the AIDS virus, and so if you were to have sex with Wilma, that would potentially harm her. And it's 1991, right? We don't have a cure for AIDS. We don't have any treatments, right? Wilma's probably going to die, for all we know, if Andrew were to give her AIDS. So the question is, do you take steps to see that Wilma is warned? And if you do decide to warn Wilma, what are you going to say to Andrew when he later shows up at your office asking how you could have revealed his confidential test results? That would not be a great situation. But if you decide not to warn Wilma, what do you say to her when 2 years later in 1993 she shows up at your office asking how you, her doctor, could possibly stand idly by as her husband infected her with a deadly virus? She knows she's positive for the virus, she knows that she was infected by her husband, and she knows that you, her doctor, knew before they reconciled that her husband would probably infect her. So Wilma knows all that, right? What are you going to say to Wilma? And so it's really a difficult decision, right? Do you breach confidentiality to protect Wilma, or do you, respect confidentiality and not warn Wilma, right? Which might result in her getting infected with the AIDS virus and dying. So what should you do? Okay. Go ahead and feel free to pause this video. I'd encourage you to think through this for a little bit. I'm going to end up moving on, but I do think it's worth sort of thinking through. Should you breach confidentiality? Yes or no? What kind of argument would you give here? So pause the video, write that down, and when you're done thinking through that, push play again and continue. All right. After discussing how you would answer that question with your group, right, come to some consensus about what you should do, then construct an argument for your position. Right? This is a task that I might have you do with your group in preparation for next time, or the kind of thing that I would have you do in general. I imagine we'll be talking about this case at our discussion. So let's look at Kipnis's views. What's his argument? What does he think? What's Kipnis's thesis? That's the thing we want to always be asking when we start reading a paper. What's this person think? What's their view? What are they trying to convince me of? So Kipnis's thesis, if you've read it, right, and hopefully you have, Kipnis' thesis is that the goal of breaching confidentiality, the goal that you're trying to achieve, is undermined by the practice of breaching confidentiality. That seems sort of strange. No, my goal in breaching confidentiality is going to be accomplished when I breach confidentiality. It's not going to be undermined by that exact practice. So we might be a little bit skeptical, but let's follow him here, right? So he says it follows that there is no conflict between the professional responsibility to protect confidential information and the professional responsibility to protect endangered third parties. So his view is that breaching confidentiality, the purpose that we do it, is generally to protect third parties. And so you might think protecting confidentiality is in conflict with that responsibility to protect the third parties, but he's arguing that there's not a conflict there. Finally, he says it also follows that doctors should never disclose confidential medical information, not even in something like the case of the infected spouse. So now we need to ask, how does he get there? Why does he think that that's right? Before we dive in, right, to his argument, I think he does a nice job of setting up, making a few points that are just generally important, right? They're worth noting because we're interested in professional ethics. So he says there are two kinds of ethical problems that conscientious professionals face. Problem number one is a problem about ignorance. Ethical problems arise when you aren't sure what some professional value that you have requires you to do. So consider this, right? Doctors may be in a position to prevent harm to third parties, but it's not well understood what doctors must do out of respect for that value. So in the case of Andrew and Wilma, you think, okay, doctors have some responsibility to protect Wilma, but what should they do to protect her? And one natural idea, right, is calling up the Moana Hotel and saying, Wilma, Andrew has HIV, AIDS, watch out. But we don't have to necessarily do that, right? There might be other steps that doctors can take to protect Wilma. So maybe you as a doctor could call up the Moana Hotel and say, Andrew has engaged in a more sophisticated social life, and you might want to encourage him to tell you about that before you sleep with him. Or, maybe you don't have to reveal the particular details about his illness, but you might encourage her to ask more questions or just make sure that she protects herself. The point here being that even though maybe as doctors we think we need to protect patients, we need to protect third parties, what exactly we need to do is unclear. And this takes us back a little bit, right, to some of the things that Michael Davis said in Professional Responsibility, just following the rules. He emphasizes the importance of exercising interpretive obedience. So I know what the rules say, I just don't exactly know how to apply the rules in this situation. I don't exactly know what this rules require me to do. Ethical problem number two is a case where we have duties that conflict. So this isn't like I don't know exactly what it means to protect third parties, or I don't exactly know how to protect third parties. Rather, the problem here is when you've got one duty that says protect third parties, and that tells you to do one thing. You've got another duty that tells you to keep confidentiality, and that points towards a different thing. So if professional values do conflict, we need some sort of priority rule. That's the solution that Kipnis suggests. So look here, I've listed a number of duties and values that professional pharmacists, not pharmacists, physicians might have, and we've got some actions. And if we look at those duties or values, we can say, well, which action do they point towards? If we think about beneficence towards patients, we might think, well, you shouldn't warn Wilma. If we think about respect for patient autonomy, we might think, well, you shouldn't warn Wilma, right? We need to respect Andrew's decision. If we look at trustworthiness, right, maybe that speaks in favor of not warning Wilma. We need to be trustworthy to Andrew. But if we think about something like caring for the public, well, maybe that does speak in favor of warning Wilma. If we look at another thing like trustworthiness, right, Wilma's not going to trust us if we don't tell her. So it seems like our duties and values point in different directions. Now here's a familiar case, right? We remember the trolley problem. We've got a trolley heading towards 5 people. If we flip the switch, we can save those 5, but doing so will kill 1. In this case, we've got some different duties. We've got a duty or a value of minimizing harm, and that speaks in favor of killing the 1, right? Flipping the switch. We also have this duty that says don't cause harm, and that would speak in favor of not flipping the switch, right? Not killing the 1. So each of those values points towards a different action. Minimizing harm points to flipping, not causing harm points to not flipping the switch. And in this case, we think minimizing harm is like the most important thing. So not everyone has this intuition, right? But most of us think in this kind of case, the duty, the value of minimizing harm wins out over the duty not to cause harm. But then we look at a different case, right? We look at the case of the bridge with a fat man who we can push to save 5 others. And we've got the same duties, we've got the same values. Minimizing harm speaks in favor of pushing, right, of killing the man. The duty not to cause harm, though, tells us don't push him, don't cause harm. But this time it seems like the second one wins out, right? The duty not to cause harm trumps the duty to minimize harm. And so this is kind of a strange situation, right? We would think, like, if we've got 2 duties and they conflict, there's one that we should follow in every case. It's not like sometimes we should follow the duty to minimize harm, and other times we should follow the duty not to cause harm. So there's a bit of a problem, right? So in both cases, we've got this conflict between our duties. Intuitively, the duty to minimize death or minimize harm trumps or outweighs the duty not to cause harm in the first case. But the opposite is true, right, in the second case. So what do we do in these cases? Right, ignore the priority rule sort of up at the top. Imagine like we're sort of down below. We've got rule 1, says minimize harm. We've got rule 2, don't cause harm. And what happens when those conflict, right? So in the one case, the switch case, over here, right, we think minimizing harm, that's the important thing. In this other case, though, again, the rules conflict. We've got them telling us to do different things, and we need to know, like, well, when do we follow rule 1? When do we minimize harm? Why do we do that in the switch case? And when do we avoid causing harm, right? Like the bridge case. To solve this Kipnis thinks we need to just come up with some priority rule, like a master rule that tells us what to do when the other rules conflict. In this case, I've sort of designed that like this. So if x, right, if x is true, and we can figure out, we need to sort of solve for x, right? What is it? Then we should obey rule 1. When x is not true, then we should obey rule 2. That priority rule tells us sort of which direction we need to go in which cases. Now, we might think that the case of the infected spouse is like that. It's a case of conflicting duties, where, like, protecting third parties, that duty conflicts with something like protecting confidential information. It seems like that, but Kipnis wants to deny that those duties actually conflict. Now, here's an argument that you might sort of have in mind, right? A reason you might sort of think Kipnis's view is correct. This isn't ultimately the view that Kipnis advances, but it's a kind of argument that he's sort of hinting towards. So premise 1 says, if the benefits to third parties of breaching confidentiality outweigh the harms to the patient of protecting confidentiality, then you should breach confidentiality. Right? It's an act utilitarian argument. Premise 2 says the benefits to Wilma of breaching confidentiality outweigh the harms to Andrew. So the benefits of breaching outweigh the harms. Therefore, the doctor should breach confidentiality. That's how an act utilitarian thinks about these kinds of cases, right? What's going to maximize happiness? do the thing that maximizes happiness, the thing that produces more benefits than harms. But Kipnis' argument isn't quite like that. Right? Kipnis is more of what we call a rule utilitarian, or you might have noticed already, right, that his view has some similarities with a kind of Kantian deontology, the principle of universalizability in particular. Like, what would we want everyone to do here? Premise 1 goes like this. If doctors are willing to breach confidentiality, then they can't promise clients that they won't. So the thought is, if you, Andrew's doctor, are willing to breach confidentiality, you can't promise him confidentiality in the first place. And if you can't promise confidentiality, then patients aren't going to undergo testing. Conclusion, right, we get, if doctors are willing to breach confidentiality, then patients aren't going to undergo testing. That's what we get from premises 1 and 2. Premise 3 says if patients aren't going to undergo testing, then not only are patients worse off, but third parties are worse off too. Right? So think about Wilma, right, in the scenario where Andrew isn't even willing to go in and find out that he has AIDS. Well, Wilma is going to get sick in that case too, right? She's going to get infected. And so if doctors like you aren't willing to protect confidentiality, patients aren't going to come to you, and then they're going to infect third parties that way. So by breaching confidentiality, you're actually undermining the goal that you had in the first place. So that gives us our conclusion. If you're willing to breach confidentiality, then not only are patients worse off, right? Patients like Andrew, because you've gone behind their back, but third parties are worse off too, right? Patients aren't seeking treatment, third parties are still getting infected. That's Kipnis' argument. To illustrate this further, I created a little bit of a diagram here. So we start at the top, say the patient visits the doctor promises confidentiality, the patient, Andrew, right, gets tested, Andrew gets treatment, and doctors respect his confidentiality. As a result, patients trust doctors, third parties are safer, although they're not completely protected, right? If Andrew's a malicious actor, right, he can still harm third parties, but third parties are safer than they would be if Andrew wasn't tested at all, right? In many cases, patients are not going to infect their spouses. And then this patient trust, right, leads to more patients visiting doctors. So that's sort of the cycle that we have going when we keep confidentiality. If we breach confidentiality, however, we create a problem in the cycle, right? The patient visits the doctor as before, right? But the doctor doesn't promise confidentiality. And as a result, in many cases, the patient doesn't get tested. And if the patient doesn't get tested, the patient doesn't get treatment. And if the patient doesn't get treatment, then there's no sort of added trust that patients have in doctors. Third parties aren't safer. We don't get any of the benefits that we got before. And so Kipnis' point is that when we fail to be able to respect confidentiality, like down here, we can't promise confidentiality here. And if we can't promise confidentiality, that creates a break in the cycle. So that's the lecture for today. There will be a follow-up that talks about objections to Kipnis' argument. We'll take a look at those a little bit later. All right.